Hello, everyone, and welcome to an introduction to ICT for smart grids. Today, we're going to talk about the concept of smart grids and what exactly is the role that information and communication technology play in the management of smart grids, in the design of smart grids, and is it very important that we make an entire lecture only about it. But before we begin, um, let's talk first about the definition of smart grids. What is a smart grid? Now, from an article that was written by Siemens, um, they talk about power generation and how it is becoming more and more decentralized, and that makes the grid management itself increasingly complex. Now, specifically, this calls for a comprehensive portfolio of physical and digital technologies, products, and solutions that allow us to actively build our energy future. Now, you all are studying renewable energy, so you know that the generation of power has been seeing a trend towards the usage of renewables in the last few years. And this in itself makes the power generation completely decentralized because, unlike before, the power generation is not done at one factory where they burn coal and they get energy out of it. So, in short, the decentralization of power generation itself makes it completely different. The concepts of monitoring and managing um, the power from the generation phase to the transportation phase and into the user distribution phase. The second thing you need to know about smart grids is that, in short, the digital technology that allows for two-way communication between the utility company and its customers and the sensoring along the transmission lines is what makes the grid smart. So, a common question that people will ask when they are not familiar with smart grids is, why are they called smart? Now, they are called smart because of the technologies that are used in managing these grids that makes it smart. So, we will talk about the paradigm shift of power generation nowadays. We will talk about these smart technologies that make our um, our grid smart in the upcoming lectures. However, right now let's look at this map, and in this map you see the icons denoting different power sources and where they are being generated. And as you can see, it is completely decentralized. So there's not a central location anymore that has all the concentration of power generation in Europe. So you have a lot of wind energy being generated in the north, which is quite fitting. And you have a lot of solar energy being generated here in the south. And along the middle, you have a lot of coal and nuclear power generation sites. And this brings us to the question of, how can we simultaneously monitor all of these locations and know exactly how much power they're generating and where should this power be directed? So, does it make sense to have the users in the north being served by power generated in the south? Take a moment to think about that, because while the power itself is the same, so you can use it anywhere, however, transferring this power or transporting this power from the south to the north will incur cable losses, which at the end does not make sense. So the monitoring and the management of these grids require a huge level of synchronization that the ICT infrastructure can provide. Now, here we see a graph that shows us the amount of power being generated throughout the years. And as you can see, in 2002, the amount of coal power being generated, together with nuclear power and gas, were extremely dominant in the power generated spectrum. However, take a leap in time and look at 2019, and you can see that um, the gas and coal, together with the uranium, doesn't even constitute 50% of the power generated. So it is safe to say that there is a big trend in relying on renewables um, in the generation of power. Again, to the same concept of relying on renewables, um, right now, the net usage of non-renewable energy is, as we said, is less than 50%. So you have here the gas power generated, you have here the uranium power generated, and you have here the coal and the hard coal and oil. And you can see that there's a huge rely on renewable energy that cannot be hidden. Now, there is, however, a problem with relying on renewables in power generation. And it is the fact that these sources of power are volatile in nature. Now, what is the definition of the word volatile? It is a combination of unpredictable and hugely vulnerable. So, the meaning of being volatile lies in the fact that if you have clouds during the day, you are not able to generate solar power anymore. So you can see here in this plot, to make it clearer, that the red curve shows the power generation distribution throughout the day, different hours of the day, when it's a sunny day. So you can say that this is the average power generated during a clear day. And then if you have a cloudy day, then you have times where the sun is reaching the PV panel. So you have a generation, a power generation, and there are times where the clouds are hiding hiding the sun from reaching the PV panel, and therefore you don't have generation. So therefore you cannot really rely and have a lot of confidence in these renewable sources because um, they are completely volatile in nature. So does that mean that we don't rely them at all? No. There are certain ways that we will show throughout the course that goes into the definition of a smart grid that can help us control the volatility nature of these renewable sources and um, kind of complement it in a way that makes us able to have 100% confidence in the operability of these sources. All right. Now we come to the point where we want to introduce the players that are in the power generation scenario. Now, the main players that we know or have always known are the utility company and the user side. So you have the utility company controlling the power generation and the transportation of this power from the generation side to the consumption side, where the user is waiting to light up his home or to use it in his factory. However, we have increasingly new players that are being introduced in the power generation scenario. First player is electrical vehicles. Now, these electrical vehicles have up to 100 kilowatt hour battery, and that's a Tesla car. And that means that these cars using ultra fast charging stations can charge 60 kilowatt hour in about 20 minutes. So that's a big amount of power that is being consumed. And this player in itself was not available previously in um, in the previous years. So in a way, this player is new to the grid and it needs to be adapted. The smart grid needs to be adapted in order to accommodate these players. Now, the reason we say that is because if you have one or two cars, that's not a big deal. However, if you have a platoon of cars, so let's say 100, 200 cars charging at the same time, then this can make a huge load on the grid. On the other hand, if you look at these cars as being mobile batteries, transporting the power from one location in the grid to another, then this creates a different understanding of the transportation of energy because it's not in one direction anymore. It's not from the direction of the utility company to the user side, but it's from the utility company to the EV, and then from the EV to the user, or from the self-generated energy for power at the user side to the EV, and then back to another user. And we will talk about that in more details later on. Now, the second player that is being, the new players that are being introduced in the smart grids are the PV panels deployed at the user side. So at home, users are allowed to deploy solar panels in order to support their own personal power demand, as well as sell it back to the main power grid. And actually, some people are making profit out of that. So people that have huge farms, they can deploy a very big area, surface area of PV panels, and they can actually generate enough power to satisfy their own needs and sell it back to the main grid, making profit. However, the power grid itself needs to be adapted in order to satisfy the possibility to push energy or push power back from the user to the power grid. And might ask why, is because the entire power grid is and was designed to be one directional, power being transported from the utility side to the user side. And at some point in time, people started generating power at their homes and using it, and that's not a problem. However, once they want to push power back into the network, then the part where the user meets the transmission network and the distribution network needs to be adapted in order to be able to push power back into the network. The next player that is being introduced into the ecosystem is the residential wind turbines. So this is a similar idea to having a solar panel deployed at the roof of your home. You deploy a wind turbine, and they're actually pretty useful. They can generate up to 3 kilowatt at 48 volts, and they can be used to charge batteries or operate traffic lights, for example. However, they are not as common as having solar panels. Sorry. So the next thing we want to talk about right now is how this the power grid is structured. So the original structure of the power grid was built in order to transport the power generated by the utility company in the form of coal burnt nuclear energy, hydropower, wind power, or solar power, transport that from the generation side to the user side. However, in order to do so, you need to pass it through cables, and in these cables, there are a lot of losses. And in order to transport that through the cables with as low of loss as possible, you need to do transforming and use this high voltage, low voltage transformation in order to bring the voltage very high in order to avoid cable losses. So at the at this borderline between very high voltages, so 110 kilovolt, to moderately high voltages, 10 kilovolts. This is the division between the transmission network and the distribution network. And we will talk about exactly the differences between the transmission network and the distribution network. But the most important thing to note between the two of them is that the transmission network was built, designed, and is controlled completely by the utility company and or the infrastructure operator. So in some countries, the electricity company itself is a government organization, and the utility companies use the infrastructure or rent the infrastructure from the electricity company. While on the other side, the distribution network is designed and updated regularly in order to serve the purposes of the users and make profit gains to the utility company. So back in time, when the transmission network and the distribution networks were designed, they were completely designed to be a single direction movement of power. So they're moving from the generation side to the user side. However, as we mentioned before, while there are some users that use solar panels in order to satisfy their own power demand, they can also push some power back into the network and sell it back to the utility company, creating profit. And in this way, the power is traveling in the opposite direction. So the and of course, whether or not we want to push this power all the way back to the transmission network and then reroute it to a completely different city, depending on the amount of power or the situation of the grid at the time, then we need to figure out the change of electricity flow direction and whether or not we want to push or transport this generated power throughout the distribution network or throughout the distribution and transmission networks. So there are other ways to move this power. So first of all, customers can use storage operators and as ways to store this generated power. So instead of pushing the power back into the distribution network or back into the power grid, they store it in batteries and they use it at times when the renewable sources are being volatile, as we explained before. However, this constitutes a challenge because who decides when to store the power and when to use it and when to sell it back to the main grid? And this is actually a very open research question that has been the focus of research in smart grid operation management for years right now. There are a lot of startups that are introducing platforms and algorithms to control smart grids and to make decisions either based on statistical models or machine learning algorithms that learn the behaviors of the users, the weather conditions, and based on the predictions for the expected power generated by solar or wind activity, they can actually decide whether to store the power in storage devices or use it for satisfying the power demand at home. So we talked about the change of electricity flow direction from the utility to the user side to it being going in the other direction from the user side to the transmission network. We talked about the customers using storage units in order to um, satisfy the parts when or the times when the power generation of renewables is being volatile. Um, and we spoke about the problems that might occur there and how we can actually control them. And we're going to go into more details later on that while we talk about the ICT technologies used in smart grids. Um, another major challenge is the electricity storage. Now, there must be a very large um, penetration of electricity storage in our distribution network. So having a couple of batteries that you fill and then use when you need power is not going to be sufficient. So you need a huge representation of storage of electricity storage space in the distribution network, and that's why there are certain companies that we label electricity storage operators right now that are providing this service. So they actually rent um, electricity storage space for you, and they link it to your own home uh, electricity grid, and therefore you can actually rent these electricity storage spaces. You can save power there from your own generated solar power, and then you can actually use that stored power whenever you want it. Now, the question becomes, of course, a question of economic feasibility. Whether or not this actually makes sense to do depends on the prices um, of power that you buy from the main grid and the rent prices, of course, of this electricity storage space. Now, the new challenge in e-mobility is represented by the charging of car platoons. So if you have one or two cars, that's not a big problem for the grid. However, if you have 100 or 200 cars being charged at the same time, then this creates a huge peak in demand that, without relying on sources like electricity storage, can be very difficult. So imagine the generation curve, the power generation curve, as being a constant line or a parabola. So if we're relying on solar energy, then we have a curve. It's a bill-shaped curve. Let's go back to the slide here. So you have a bill-shaped curve, right, during a sunny day. And let's assume that the power demand is at this line. So it's a fairly constant power demand. There are times when the power demand itself is higher than the generation, and that's when there is not enough sun to power up the PV at maximum intensity. And there are times when the power generation itself is higher than the power demand, and that's at midday. And now let's assume that um, at these times when the power generation itself is not sufficiently high, we don't have anywhere else to go. So we don't have any place to buy power from the main grid, for example. So let's assume that you live in the middle of the desert, you don't have access to power, and you're trying to be completely self-sufficient. Then there is no way to satisfy your own power demand at this area. However, if you do have battery systems that you have on site at home, you can use the times when your power demand is lower than your generated power. Since you're not going to do anything with this, you cannot sell it back to the grid, then you can store this excess power generated into batteries and then wait until your power demand is higher than the power generated, and you can actually use it to push up this red curve up to here. And at that case, you are completely self-sufficient. Also, you can use it if suddenly a cloud comes in the sky and your power generation drops to the blue curve, you can still use the battery systems to keep your um, balance at the red curve, or at least keep it at the power demanded um, at that time of the day. So the reason we talk about e-cars in this situation is because e-cars together suddenly starting to charge creates a spike in the power demand. And in order to satisfy that, we either need to schedule the charging of the cars such that it does not create a huge spike in the power demand, but to keep a constant level of power demand. So one car starts charging, once it finishes or before it finishes, another one starts charging. So the power demand is constant across time, and it does not create a huge spike that cannot be satisfied either with uh, power generation sources or battery systems. And that brings us to the next point of demand shaping. And demand shaping is the scheduling of electrical equipments in order to keep a constant power demand profile and not hugely changing, full of spikes, um, power demand profile. And there are some applications, and as I said, some startups that provide some platforms that actually do this for you. Um, so you kind of hook up all your electrical equipment to smart plugs, and the platform turns on the electrical equipment um, in order to shape the power demand. So, for example, you don't have your iron, your kettle, your washing machine, your dryer, and your air conditioning all on at the same time, which creates a huge spike in the power demand profile and forces you to buy more energy, and with buying more to buy more power from the utility company, and with buying more you're paying more, right? And the same thing can go for e-cars charging at charging stations. So when you have 200 cars, you can satisfy the user requirements. So the user might specify the time he needs the car back. So he needs to have the car after, um, let's say, 2 hours or 3 hours, and you can schedule the charging of the car accordingly. So you don't have to charge it right at the time it gets plugged into um, the charging station, but you can schedule that at a later time. Okay, so we've spoken about the transmission network and the distribution network. Now let's have a look at um, a demo that we presented in the 5G Summit that represents different use cases of the smart grid world of tomorrow, or how we envision it. Now, in this video, you have here you have the utility grid um, generating energy via coal. So you have here the CO2 emissions, right? And you have the scenario of today, the architecture of the power grid today, which is a centralized architecture with the utility company generating the power. And you have here the transmission network. We assume the transmission network ends at this breaker here. So you then can distribute the power between the different households, right? And it's a fairly simple structure. You can see it's a one-directional structure that goes from the utility company to the transformers, and from the transformers being distributed to the users. You can actually see the power consumption at each household. So, for example, this household is using 2 kilowatts of power and is being completely powered by the utility company. And so he's drawing all his power demand from the power grid. Now, this also constitutes a power loss in the power lines. So you can see here the power being transported into the lines. And for example, this power line connecting this part of the grid, which are three different households, carries 5.29 kilowatt, and there is a resistance actually, no, this is the power consumption. So this is the cable losses in this power line of 141 watts. So this might not seem um, like a lot, like a big deal, but if you assume that here you have maybe 10 to 12 cables or 10 to 12 power lines, and each power line there's between 150 and 200 watts being lost. So in all, you might have 2 to 3 kilowatt in a very small area. So at the level of a city, of an entire city, cable losses constitute a huge loss in power. All right. So again, here the small cables, you have smaller cable losses, and you can see that all the households are consuming completely from the power grid. Now, let's talk about the scenario of tomorrow. What do we envision for the grid of tomorrow? Now, thanks to a ultra reliable and low latency communication system, you can see it by these circles expanding here, the entire grid becomes synchronized. So when we have a self-sufficient, renewable energy reliant power grid, what happens is that in the case when we don't have um, power to be generated, we can use the battery systems that we have at home or the battery systems that are described by the electric vehicles that we have. So you can use the electric vehicle itself as a battery to store power. So you can actually divide the bigger smart grid into smaller islands that we call microgrids. Now, these microgrids might be 2, 3, or 4 households bundled up together. Now, this cooperation, this microgrid can be designed or formed individually. It means that it is formed kind of dynamically, so it changes depending on the power demand and the power generation, or it can be statically formed. So, for example, these three neighbors decide to form a microgrid, or the utility company forms a microgrid of these three houses together, and they actually start sharing the power between them. So here we see that, for example, this user is generating around 1 kilowatt from solar energy. It has a total power demand of 2 kilowatt. So it actually generates 1 kilowatt. It it uses 1.6 kilowatt from the battery, and it pushes half kilowatt into the main grid. So in total, it actually it consumes 2 kilowatts in its own power demand, and it pushes zero point 0.5 kilowatt to its neighbors. So it's actually pushing energy or pushing power to these two neighbors. And it uses 1.5 kilowatt from the battery and 1 kilowatt from the renewable generated power. And then if you look at another neighbor, you can actually see that they are not pushing power into the main grid. So in this case, this one also does. So these two provide this house here, the third one in the microgrid, with enough power to cover its own demand. And this concept reduces the losses in the transmission lines. And why does it do so? Because instead of transferring the power from the utility side all the way to the user side, this cuts a long way from this transportation of power. And therefore, it reduces the cable losses significantly. And that's only the first thing. The second thing is that it creates a concept of self-sufficiency and self-sustainability. Now, this cooperation here can go on forever as long as we rely on the battery systems and every day the sun shines and can create more solar generated energy to rely on. However, what happens when you don't have enough self-generated power to use. So here, for example, you can see that this guy gets 1 kilowatt from the power grid, which is from his neighbors. He gets 1 kilowatt from the battery systems that he has. He gets 1 kilowatt from the uh, the solar um, the solar panels, and he's consuming it. So again, the question that we were asking was how. Um, sorry, I lost my line of thought. Yeah, what happens when you don't have solar energy, right? What happens if you don't have solar energy through the day to power up your batteries? Now you can rely on a different source of renewable energy, or you can rely on the energy generated by the utility company. Now in this scenario, we are presenting a completely renewable uh, scenario. So you don't have coal generated power, but you have wind generated power. And the reason why we need communications for this is that once there is an enormous amount of wind energy being generated, you cannot, um, how to say that, you cannot schedule that. So it happens, and at the time it happens, you need to notify the user side, so the distribution network, and say that, okay, right now I have a lot of power being generated as a utility company, and I need to push it into the network in order for you guys to start filling your batteries. So please stop using energy from the battery, switch the direction of the power transmission, and start refilling your batteries. And this requires a ultra reliable and very low latency communications in order to synchronize the network at the time the power starts being generated and transferred into the network. So here you can see that the wind generated power starts being pushed inside the grid, and then all the users start filling their batteries. And here you can see that, for example, this guy is getting 1.5 kilowatt from the main grid, and he is filling his battery with zero point 0.5 kilowatt. So all the users here start filling their batteries. So you can see, for example, again here, he's getting 1.5 kilowatt from the power grid. He's getting 1 kilowatt from solar energy generation, and he's filling his battery with 0.5 kilowatt. Everybody is refilling the battery systems while the energy or the power generated from the utility side is being provided. Now, as we said, in this case, the cable losses are not reduced anymore. However, once this scenario ends, once the wind generation stops, the concept of islands start forming again, and people start forming these islands, these microgrids that we talked about, and they start using their battery systems again. Now, what happens at night is that the solar generated energy drops. So now the users have no solar generated power, and they have to rely completely on the battery systems that they have. So you can see here that this user is, for example, here this user is having a power demand of 2 kilowatt. It is using 2.57 kilowatt or 2.5 kilowatt from the battery systems, satisfying his own power demand and pushing 0.5 kilowatt into the microgrid to support this guy. And so this actually shows us that some people will decide to use their own battery systems for themselves, and some others will choose to use their battery systems to help others. It all is dependent on these microgrids and how they are managed. If they are managed solely by the user side, so by users, then there might be a concept of individuality there, or a complete dependability on economic profit. However, if it is managed by a central entity or a company that can create the best outcome for all users, then it might actually be reaching equilibriums there. So it's not always about satisfying the individual needs, but the best possible economic outcome might come from satisfying the community need. So this shows us the different scenarios that we might look on in order to talk about um, renewable energy sources, smart grids, how we can actually use battery systems in order to satisfy the unpredictability of the volatility of these renewable sources. So this ends this part of the lecture. Um, in the next part of the lecture, we will talk about, excuse me, we will start talking about the transmission network and the distribution network, the differences between the two of them, and what are the main issues and challenges. And then we will talk about the role of ICT in filling in the blanks and solving the challenges that we face through these networks. Thank you for listening and see you in the next video.